Welcome you all to the member lecture series. Today, the title of the lecture that Congressman Jeff Fortenberry will be discussing is the Genocide Resolution, responding to ISIS and the threats to international religious liberty. We are very much appreciative of him being here. I also want to thank Bethany DeMin for her efforts in our policy lectures here at FRC. Want to welcome you. If you're joining us by live webcast, welcome. We're glad you're with us. Those of you watching here or at home, also just a reminder that we do tape these lectures, so keep an eye out for the video on our website or YouTube when those are made available. Please share them with others you know on social media. Congressman Fortenberry authorized and sponsored H-Con Res 75, expressing the sense of Congress that the atrocities perpetuated by ISIL against religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq and Syria constituted war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. He worked in a bipartisan fashion with Congrwoman Eshoo, others. There were a lot of organizations involved in this, watching what has occurred over in the Middle East. Good news is, with Congressman Fortenberry's leadership, this resolution passed in the House of Representatives by an incredible vote of 393 votes to 0. After much pressure, including the House action, Secretary John Kerry, the State Department did in fact declare the attacks on Christians and other religious minorities and ethnicities to constitute genocide. Let me just give you a little background on Congressman Fortenberry. I've gotten to know him a little bit over the years. He's been a real leader on a variety of issues. He represents Nebraska's 1st Congressional District. He is a member of the House Appropriations Committee and serves on 3 subcommittees of importance to both national and economic security, energy and water, military construction, veterans affairs, and state and foreign appropriations. So obviously this is right in his wheelhouse. Congressman Fortenberry serves as the co-chair of the Nuclear Security Working Group, the co-chair of the Congressional Study Group on Europe. Prior to serving in Congress, a little more background, he worked in the publishing industry as an executive in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he served on the Lincoln City Council as well from 1997 to 2001. Congressman Fortenberry has a lot of personal experience in small business, public policy analysis, and economic development. He earned his bachelor's degree in economics and 2 master's degrees, 1 in public policy. He and his wife Celeste live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and have 5 daughters. His work in Congress is rooted in the belief that our nation depends on the strength of our families and communities. So without further ado, please welcome Congressman Fortenberry.
Well, thank you, David, for the kind introduction, and all of you here with the Family Research Council. Thank you for what you do. It's a pretty fragmented culture that we live in. The promise of peace seems very far away, but you keep working steadily with good and uplifting attitudes, and that's sometimes tough in the environment that we're in. So I want to thank you for your good work. David, thank you again for the generous introduction, and particularly mentioning my 5 daughters. We also have a female dog, and I thought we had 2 hens till recently. One seems to be developing into a rooster. At the Lincoln City Council, well, the ordinances in Lincoln prevent you from having a rooster, and you can only have 2 hens if you're interested in urban farming. We have a little backyard there. You have a garden, several garden plots, and bees, as well as apple trees. And the chickens have been an ongoing addition to the little micro farm for many years. We haven't had any of late, and they have been free range around the backyard, but that's also coming to a stop as I'm tired of cleaning up the mess on my stoop. So I'm in the process of building a very large coop, but there is a male addition to my family apparently in the rooster. Thank you very much. Thank you. You were very generous again in your comments about the effort to pass the Genocide Resolution in the House. Genocide is a powerful word, but it was very clear to me, you, and many others around the country, including organizations and persecuted peoples, that this was a reality, that you cannot deny reality, that ISIS is systematically attempting to exterminate Christianity, to exterminate the Yazidi community, to exterminate other religious minorities in vast areas of Iraq as well as Syria. There has been for a very long time a scandal of indifference, a scandal of silence on this very question. And so that's why I thought it appropriate, along with other members of Goodwill who wanted to do something but nobody was really clear on what could be done, that perhaps to focus the mind and focus the effort around the appropriate designation of what in reality was happening, that this is a genocide being committed against people because of their faith, would be one way in which we can attack this scandal of silence and create a gateway for further policy considerations that would help the beleaguered minority communities in Iraq and in Syria. After I gave a speech on the topic about 6 weeks ago, there had been a Yazidi man in the gallery of the House of Representatives, and he came to my office afterward to meet me. He had, after the liberation of Mount Sinjar, he had returned recently to Sinjar, the area where he's from, and he went to see his family home. And next to his family home had been a church, a Christian church. It was in rubble, a pile of rubble. He took it upon himself by hand to fashion a wooden cross, 2 little planks of wood, and to go plant it on that pile of rubble. As he told me, these were my brothers. When I was a child, I ate and played with them. They were my neighbors. And he wanted to do something as a sign of solidarity as a Yazidi man for his Christian brothers in the area there. There are people of goodwill still in the world who are willing to sacrifice, who are willing to say that the future of the Middle East, its very stability, depends upon what was once a rich and diverse tapestry of various religious traditions. ISIS's attempt to exterminate this with their twisted theology, with their 8th century barbarism, unfortunately with 21st century weaponry, is not only a threat to human dignity, it's a threat to the very stability of the Middle East in the future and the principles of civilization itself. That's why it was so important to continue to press to call this what it is, a genocide in the Middle East, and again create the preconditions for further policy considerations that it could include, once there is some type of political security and economic as well as cultural settlement, both in Syria as well as in Iraq, that could include the right to return, perhaps a safe haven type of concept, particularly in the Middle East, whereby you would have militia units made up of Christians, Yezidis, attached to the Peshmerga, the Kurdish military units that are doing tremendous work and sacrificing for the stability of their people and taking in huge influxes of refugees, attached to the Peshmerga under their control with linkages to the Iraqi central government, so you create a more of a sub-autonomous region there in the Nineveh Plain so that the restoration of stability can occur there. The restoration of what is only right and proper, that people who claim this as their ancient homeland can once again return. And perhaps create the conditions in which, again, religious minorities are appropriately integrated into security and governance structures for the long term so that we never have to go through this horror again. Now, that's a long way off from now. But nonetheless, the Genocide Resolution gave rise, at least to the conversation of what the potential should be, the potential outcome should be. One of the international media who pressed me on this topic after the Genocide Resolution passed kept saying, what does it mean? It's just a word. Well, I laid all of these things out, but I also said this to that person. I said, when have you ever heard a discussion about the Christian tradition in the Middle East? When have you ever heard of the other religious minority traditions in the Middle East. You have never heard of this. You have never talked about it. You have never talked about, again, the rich tapestry of religious diversity that once existed in the Middle East. And again, is necessary for the conditions of stability going forward. Now we're having that conversation. And again, hopefully this creates the preconditions for policy outcomes that are necessary for the long-term viability of the entire area. To the Genocide Resolution itself, it really was an extraordinary effort on the part of many people. Internally, as David mentioned, I worked with Congresswoman Anna Eshoo from California, who is Chaldean in her own ethnic background. She has a beautiful sensitivity to the plight of the ancient Christian tradition in Iraq and Syria. Very passionate. We worked in a bipartisan fashion to continue to urge colleagues, again, many of them who were disposed to doing something but didn't know exactly what to do, to sign on to this resolution. Numbers built. At the same time, multiple outside organizations, including the Family Research Council, helped create the momentum for the conversation that created a political environment in which all of this could be made possible. At the same time, near the same time, Secretary Kerry came before the subcommittee on State Department operations and foreign operations, in which I serve, the Appropriations Subcommittee. And I used my time with him to talk directly about this issue. Of all of the spectrum of the assaults on human dignity across the world, you only have about 5 minutes in front of the Secretary. But I thought I'd prioritize this one because it is essential to the principles of civilization itself. If one group of people can exterminate another in the name of so-called religion, the world has no hope. So I used the time there and gave my arguments to the Secretary as to why this should occur, but also expressed to him that I knew he had sympathies in this regard, because he did. And to his credit, through the process of the House passing the resolution 393-0. I mean, it's hard for us to pass a Mother's Day resolution 393-0. It was a real stamp, not only of approval of something, it was a transpartisan effort to make a clear statement of moral resolve that overcame any of the typical partisan divides and questioning. I was really surprised by that outcome. You always have some people who are going to object for one reason, not one. And I think that strong effort of the House, now combined with Secretary Kerry's designation of genocide, makes a clear statement. The full weight and authority and the moral clarity of the United States stands behind this proposition that you cannot systematically attempt to eliminate from these areas persons based upon their religious faith tradition just because they're minorities and they don't have as big of a gun as you have. That's the reality of what just happened. From there, we move into the next phases of discussion about the translation of this, and it has various implications. Again, I discussed the concept of creating security for people in the Middle East who have a minority religious tradition, integration into governance structures into the future, and ongoing protective mechanisms. There are questions regarding migration. The default position automatically was the genocide designation would lead to just simply the migration question or the migration option becoming much more of a viable solution for people in need. And for some people, that is necessary. But as I've just learned, Cardinal Dolan came from the area recently, and he said people want to stay. Of course they would want to stay. If you were forced to flee from your home and were in proximity to it and had some hope of future stability, you would want to go back and rebuild. That's human nature. So the migration question shouldn't necessarily be the default or fullness of an answer. It is an answer for some persons in dire need whose lives are at great risk. But the fullness of the answer is, again, to continue the efforts that we have substantially made through our appropriations to support people where they are, whether or not they're in refugee camps or through non-governmental organizations that are providing relief and aid temporarily to keep people from dying, but also to have them in a position to potentially return when conditions are safe, but also to use the powers and authority that we have in combination with other countries to continue to create the conditions for stability in Iraq, to continue to try to defeat ISIS and their barbaric intentions, to continue to work with other countries, as delicate as this is, for some type of transition of governance in Syria so that the brutality of the current dictator is not justified, but the reality of an absence of government creating a vacuum that could empower ISIS further also isn't occurring. So a transition process involving the international community, including the Russians, has to be in order to create, hopefully, perhaps miraculously, an outcome in Syria that stabilizes governance structure and includes protections for religious minorities. Approximately 10% of Syrians are Christian, by the way. The third aspect of this is looking down the horizon. How do you create, again, the ongoing necessity of a Sunni Arab-led coalition, along with us and along with others, to actively be engaged in defeating ISIS, but creating the conditions for future stability and security for everyone in the region? Those are the bigger, larger, looming questions. But one concept, again, is to create the safe haven in a particular area, the Nineveh Plain, which would allow the right of return, allow for the development of special types of security forces, again, under the authority of the Peshmerga and connected in some way with the Iraqi central government, so that we can exercise new options versus not thinking about this at all. Over the weekend, I had an extraordinary experience. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, where it was mentioned. The largest community of Yezidis who've taken refuge in America live in my hometown. Over 1,000 people live there, about 240 families. When the Genocide Resolution was passed, there was great rejoicing in that community. I understand from reports that I've gotten from the Kurdish areas, there was 3 days of celebration among the Christian community as well. Just the fact that the United States declared this has given people hope for movement of the fundamental questions that I just laid out. The Yazidi community in Nebraska is a result of legislation that I had worked on earlier with others, and it expanded the opportunity for Yazidis and others who stood side by side, our troops at the height of the Iraq War, placing themselves at great personal risk in battle and then afterward as well, providing translation services. By doing so, they earned their citizenship in America. And I'm grateful they've chosen my town. Many Yezidis in America chose, through an odd convergence of things, refugee resettlement and other reasons, they've chosen Lincoln, Nebraska to have their home. When the Genocide Resolution passed, the Yazidi community, who I've been working with, by the way, for a number of years, it's not just around this incident, we've had others earlier, and the community has come to me on many occasions. But about 1.5 years ago, when the women and children and some of the men as well were trapped on Mount Sinjar, the community came to me in Nebraska in my office, a number of young men who I had not met, who had been military translators, again, stood side by side, our own troops, pleading with me, begging me, on the verge of tears, on the verge of anger, and I don't blame them. Congressman, do something. Something must be done. My mother is on the top of the mountain now. They have no food. They have no water. ISIS is coming now. There is no time for discussion. Do something. Act now. To the Yazidi community credit, they took their case as well to Washington, the White House. The National Security Council met with them quickly. The House of Representatives, there was a working resolution, by the way, already in process, but some additional language was crafted and put in it that called for an international humanitarian response. I don't know if there's a connection to the White House's initiative, and I commend President Obama for undertaking the airstrikes which saved innocent people off that mountain. I don't know if there's the connection directly with the House's resolution, but certainly, hopefully, it created the environment in which that consideration, that decision could be made by the White House. Lives were saved through appropriate use of American power. Food was dropped in. One of the men who spoke this weekend in Nebraska had his little boy with him. His little boy had, apparently, I've not been there, Mount Sinjar can be quite precarious, had fallen off the mountain, broken his leg. His leg he showed me the scar, his bone must have been sticking out of the leg. The scar was quite harsh. He knew the airdrop came and gave them water, but because they were being shot at constantly, he decided to flee. I think they walked 36 hours across open desert, no water. His little boy with the broken leg couldn't even cry anymore. His throat was so parched from thirst. Just one of the hundreds of stories that are there. But this man was there again to give encouragement to the Yazidi community who had gathered for their new year. They had come to my office and pleaded, and America took action. Then we were able to pass the Genocide Resolution again. It created a moment of hope for the community, a decisive focus of attention on their plight and the plight of Christians and others, and again, the possibility of further policy considerations to help. 6 weeks ago, they contacted me again and said, we want to come by your office, Congressman, and thank you. I said, well, that's not really necessary. And I said, whenever you have a community celebration of some kind, let me know and I'll come by. So the Yazidi New Year, and I don't know a whole lot about the religious tradition, but I know one thing. These are people dedicated to peace. These are people, one man particularly, risked his own life by planting a Christian cross on his neighbor's church. That's a marked character of these people in their faith tradition. And they are very welcome in my hometown. And they are very welcome to be new Americans. And so I went to this celebration on Saturday. The people, it was like we have a tunnel walk at the Nebraska football games. I don't know where you all went to college, but they played motivating music and the team gets fired up and they come running out of the tunnel. That's what I felt like when I came there. They had created this kind of tunnel walk for me. And the men of the community all greeted me humbly. And then the women of the community were next and greeted me as well. And there were children there and babies crying. It was just a lot of fun. I ate so much food that I told one of the Yazidi men there, somebody's got to open a Yazidi restaurant in Lincoln. It was really quite good. But the deeper issue for me was, again, to see this community in a moment of peace, and as the gentleman who spoke said, we have a smile now because God has given us hope. Our wounds are deep, and the suffering continues still. But for a moment, there was a smile. And we had a beautiful celebration on Saturday. And they even hung the Yazidi flag up, which kind of has it's yellow and red. And I pointed out to them the red is very similar to the University of Nebraska's Cornhusker red that the football team wore. So all of these things, again, converged, and the Yazidis have made their home in Nebraska, appropriately so and gladly so from my perspective. But one of the things that I told them is what I've just told you. Continue to be good Americans. Continue to integrate into the community and make a contribution to your own family's well-being and the vitality and diversity of the community, just like you're doing. And they know very well that we have a tremendous amount of work to do for those remaining. And I proposed some of the ideas that I've just talked to you about in terms of safe havens and rights of return, new types of security forces under the authority of the Peshmerga with some linkage to the Iraqi central government. I talked about this with the young men who had been basically in our military. And by the way, I asked all of them who were there to come forward. And it wasn't 2 or 3. It was more like 40. Very significant number of the young men there had been translators for us, and then consequently had been able to bring families here. But when I told them about these policy options, I just want to get their feedback, see how they react. Again, uplifted, to have a vision of what could possibly be, to have some commitment to work on a constructive outcome here in the midst of the degradation, in the midst of the horror, to give a little sense of hope, not just for a momentary reprieve that we have called this what it is, a genocide, but the idea of working toward some structural change that is absolutely essential, again, for human dignity, the stability of the Middle East, and civilization itself, resounded with them. And it was a very good affirmation for me as I sit up here and try to work with other members as well to figure out the appropriate vehicles for policy construct that could lead to these outcomes, and to work with the international community. And we've had lots of levels of dialogue, by the way, with the European Union, with Kurdish representatives as well, with the Christian community, and the diversity within the Christian community about these concepts. So again, I'm grateful for your interest in the topic. I'm grateful to Tony Perkins, who had me on his show on several occasions to talk about the genocide that was happening, which helped, again, create the political conditions in the country by which this would be considered in Congress. Your efforts made a significant contribution, and for that I'm very grateful. So with that, I'll stop. David told me I should ask if there's any thoughts or ideas or questions or problems I can help solve.
Peter Sprigg with FRC, welcome. You mentioned that the Yezidis who have come to Lincoln and so forth, you welcome them as immigrants, and particularly the ones who work with our military are welcome to become citizens. Of course, there was controversy with Donald Trump saying that there should be a moratorium on Muslim immigration to the country. I just wondered if you would share your thoughts on, well, maybe explain a little bit what the law is, but then also what you think the policy should be with respect to accepting victims of persecution, documented persecution, as immigrants, as opposed to just accepting refugees and so forth.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question. It's a complex question, and one that has to be worked out with serious deliberation. My daughter is a freshman in college, and she texted me one day and said, "Dad, what's the Republican position on the migration crisis?" And I wrote her back and I said, well, there's three principles here. First of all, people have a right to have their life protected. Secondly, we, along with other countries, must attack the unjust structures that are forcing people to flee. But third is there can be no charity without order. And if you look at what's happened, particularly in Europe, with the migrant crisis and the inability of these countries to discern who's who, and certain countries putting up fences and other countries throwing their doors wide open, but then again, all of the social costs and security costs being pushed into local communities. That's not fair on a number of levels. It's not fair to the people who are there. It's not fair to migrants who are really in true desperate need. If someone is just hopping the fence for a better life, it's not fair to the people who are in desperate conditions and have a right to have their life protected. So this is why you have to balance all of these considerations. In the United States, in the Congress, in the House, we've passed a measure that would enhance security screening, particularly for migrants from Syria. I think that's perfectly appropriate. We don't want anybody slipping in here that it was in some way connected to ISIS. I mean, San Bernardino, that wasn't the case there necessarily, but it's a wake-up call. And do you really feel confident in Europe's security measures regarding screening processes? I'm sure you don't, Peter. It's hard to be confident when you have this kind of chaotic situation. So there's an important balance here. Our humanitarian impulse is to, and rightfully so, help people who are in imminent danger of death. And there are a number of ways we can do that, and we're doing it quite a bit, again, with very large levels of expenditure in terms of refugee relief and helping people, again, stay proximate to where they were as long as they're safe. What you don't want to see, though, is a creation of permanent refugee camps. Lebanon has not gone that direction because they don't have the best of experiences with that. You want, instead of this becoming a sadly normalized condition of people fleeing and being in refugee camps, I think what I've proposed in terms of the various components of answering the question, right to return, future security settlements, the possibility of safe havens, along with economic development measures there, create the conditions in which people can stay or be proximate to where they came from without having to enter into the migration system. The refugee and migration system will continue to be a component of the answer, but again, all of the question almost automatically goes there. The other problem with this is there's capacity issues of individual countries, particularly in Europe, but also here, of how many people can be absorbed and appropriately enculturated so that they are sharing the values of this country. And I will say this, anybody whose religion teaches them that they can kill others, that's not a religion at all. That's a death cult. That's not a Western value. That is not an American value. They do not belong in America. Or you will be sowing the seeds for the undermining of the very system that gave rise to the ability to be generous in the first place to people in need. Where these lines are, that's delicate. It's subject to debate. But just having the questions surround migration alone is not the fullness of the answer. It involves all the other components that I have spoken to today from my perspective. Yes.
My name is Nathan Weininger with the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative. I'd like to thank you and your leadership for my organization, and particularly for my colleague, former Congressman Frank Wolf, who really appreciates your work on these issues. My question is in regards to further diplomatic work. Lots of people seem to think that various countries in the region maybe aren't pulling their full weight in stopping ISIS, maybe not just militarily, but maybe there's some buying of oil that's happening by various countries. Do you know, is the State Department, given the genocide designation, putting more pressure on those countries? Is that something Congress can ask of our diplomatic corps, et cetera?
I can. The answer is yes. Now, I can't tell you here's the direct evidence of that, but these conversations have been ongoing as to how you stop the financing mechanism that ISIS has. Obviously, some of that was oil, and ISIS's ability, again, I can't show you the proof of that, but I suspect has been seriously degraded now because of, again, our ability to use diplomacy and other means, and sometimes air power, to stop the means by which they're financing themselves. And of course, they seized huge caches of American weaponry when the Iraqi army dropped it and fled. So this is an ongoing problem. The other component of this is there's been an ongoing movement toward direct arming of the Peshmerga, who again have shown a willingness to fight and a willingness to share in the value that innocent people should have their life protected. And so the Kurdish area has absorbed huge numbers of refugees, and I think they should be commended for this. And I think the more that we can do to help the Kurdish government protect itself and protect others, it is an appropriate policy shift. And the Iraqi central government needs to adjust to that reality. They also, I would like, ideally, for them to play the constructive role in coming to the same conclusion. But we're kind of in the midst of that now. So we don't want a breakage of relationships and linkages, but we need to move armaments and assistance to where it's being most effectively used. So the Peshmerga, from my perspective, have been doing sacrificial heavy lifting in that regard. Other allies, you have to continue to press. There is this, I hear it all the time, although I think this needs to shift and will shift in the 21st century. You're the only superpower. You must do something. Well, a lot of other countries in the world have been built off of, their economies have been built out and their security depends upon American sacrifice. That has been the post-World War II construct. But we're not going to continue to do this heavy lifting alone. Other countries who have benefited greatly by the sacrifice of our troops and the sacrifice of our financing and the build out of governance systems have to change their perspectives much more rapidly to share in a proportionate way, based upon their capacity, the load of creating the conditions for international stability. This comes up all the time, and the most easiest manifestation of it is I just had this conversation with the Germans. Pay your NATO dues. Defense budgets in Europe, for the most part, some countries are better than others, and some translate it differently than we do, but still rely on us and free ride off of our capabilities. Now, because we're advanced and they need that, we'll continue to play a lead role, but the robust partnerships must be built. That's the 21st century architecture for international stability. That will be the essential nature, along with the possibility of further economic integration, of the transatlantic alliance. There is a common values proposition, obviously, between Europe and America that frankly could be very inviting and should be very inviting to Central and South America, to the African continent, in terms of forms of governance, forms of economy, and the protection of human dignity. And that could stand in sharp contrast to other experiments across the world, whether that's the revived Russian nationalistic myth or the Chinese hybrid communist capitalistic model, which interestingly elevates the idea of the individual's pursuit of economic wealth, but does not unleash individual dignity through political expression or religious expression. And so it's a question. Your question is, I'm going into something a little tangential to your question, but I think that's the architecture and framework to get to the heart of the matter. When you strengthen ties based upon values and build out systems of governance appropriate to the culture that you're in, that at its core protect human dignity, and then therefore create the necessity for stabilized transitions of power, and create economies that are consistent with human flourishing. It prevents the wrong form of nationalism taking hold in ideologies that lead to belligerent behavior. So that's a broader discussion about what I call the 3Ds: strong defense, smart diplomacy, and sustainable development, as the necessary ingredients for international stability and our own national security. And then we benefit as well, economically and culturally. I just gave you a long conversation about that beautiful event I had Saturday with the Yazidi community. We replenish ourselves with persons like the Yezidis who've made America their new home, with variations of culture and themes, but unified around a central narrative. We stand in solidarity as brothers. That family is good, that respect for one another and differences is good, that working hard and taking care of yourself is good, seizing opportunity is good, and contributing to community is good. That's the answer for the world, by the way, right there. That's deeper than your question, but yes, the issues of trying to enhance diplomatic and security cooperation are forefront and must be vigorously continue to be exercised, particularly with Sunni Arab nations. It's their neighborhood. They must be willing to fight for it. But the transition to, again, forms of governance that are inclusive of and protective of minority populations so that they can make a ongoing rightful contribution to the well-being and flourishing of those societies is also a values proposition that I believe has to sit side by side security and economic propositions. When have you ever heard that conversation in the halls of Congress or in the White House? You don't. This organization is built around the concept of values. You want stability in the world, you got to start with the value. Then you build it out from there in terms of governance and economics and security. That should all be about reinforcing that value. But without the value, you're just dealing in transactions. That's not a solution for long-term peace in the world. Well, David, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time. I enjoyed thank you all for listening to me. I enjoyed the bit of interaction we had. But again, if I could leave you with this one thought. On Saturday, I couldn't have been more proud to be an American. This beautiful gift of community and thankfulness and gratitude being expressed to me as a representative of the broader community in Nebraska by a set of new Americans who are under grave persecution, who stood in solidarity with Christian brothers and sisters and others who are under grave persecution, is exactly the type of American value that we ought to be celebrating. Thank you very much.